So as I said in the intro, we're just doing chapters 1 and 2 today. Chapter 1 is pretty short and sweet. It's just a first look at anatomy. Let's do a little bit of definitions, do a few regional terms, some positional terms, and I'll tell you about what we would have done in class, and it's stuff that I highly recommend that you do on your own today, even if you're technically not obligated. So, history of human anatomy, definition of anatomy, structural organization of the body, and precise language of anatomy. Anatomy is the study of structure. It is Greek for to cut up or cut open. It often implies the function of a structure. Structure and function are always going to be intimately related. Physiology is the study of function. It often focuses very much on very specific cell biology, which is why the second half of today is going to be all about cells. Microscopic anatomy. So there's 4 anatomical disciplines. I've actually edited these slides quite a bit from what you might find in your textbook. I was always taught that there's 4 major anatomical disciplines. I think your textbook separates it out a little bit differently. I learned gross anatomy, histology, embryology, and neuroanatomy as the 4 major disciplines. So they have it as microscopic anatomy, including cytology, which is the study of cells, and histology, which is the study of tissues. We're going to cover organizational levels of the body soon, and you'll see that cells make up tissues. So that's how that interrelates. Gross anatomy, we don't mean gross as in disgusting, although when it's a cadaver, arguably you could say that. We mean large scale, things that can be seen with the unaided eye. We don't need magnifying glasses, we don't need microscopes. It is large scale. Things that you can point at and say, that's what that's called. That's gross anatomy. Embryology is the study of the development of the human body from fertilized egg to fetus. So the first 12 weeks of development are the embryologic state, the embryologic phase. And when you're studying anatomy, often you'll find things and say, wow, that is super weird. Why is it like that? And the answer is almost always because of embryological development. And anytime we have those questions, I can typically answer them with embryology facts. It's very fun. Neuroanatomy is my specific area of focus. I could go all day about neuro questions. Ask all the neuro questions you want. I would say about a third of this class, the last third of this class is going to be based in neuroscience, and it is super fun for me. I love it. Neuroanatomy is great. So some other sort of subdisciplines in the gross anatomy field: comparative anatomy, examining similarities and differences between different species. We're not going to do a ton of that. We are clinicians for the most part. You're all going into nursing. You're going to be working with humans, not dogs, not cats, not birds. So there won't be very much comparative anatomy in this course. And developmental anatomy, study of structure changes within an individual from conception through maturity. We cover a bit of aging physiology from time to time. That does come up. All right, regional anatomy is related to what we do: surface anatomy, systemic anatomy. At the undergraduate level, we pretty much focus on systemic anatomy. We do one system at a time. It's also possible to study anatomy from the regional perspective and say, okay, now let's study every single thing that happens in the arm. Let's study everything that happens in the thoracic cavity. Let's study everything that happens in the body wall, and so on and so forth. And you at that point have to learn, how this structure is deep to this structure, superficial to this structure, anterior to that structure. We don't do as much of that in here. There is, I think, one lecture on surface anatomy. And that will be useful for you as clinicians. Again, identifying regions where you can palpate arteries, veins, where you can do lines, where you can, phlebotomy sort of things. It's very useful to you. Okay, into the actual science, the structural organization of the body. So the very, very basic structure of all matter in the universe, everything is atoms. Atoms make up molecules. When you combine molecules, In certain organizational patterns, you can come up with cells. Cells put together, a couple of different functional types of cells working together is a tissue. A couple of different functional types of tissues together is an organ. Then you get organ systems. This is where people actually mix these things up. Organs, then organ systems. So for example, your heart, your blood vessels, and your blood make up your cardiovascular system, and that's multiple organs. Your digestive system is your gastrointestinal tract, plus your liver and your pancreas are actually included in your gastrointestinal system. Then when you have multiple organ systems, you have an organism. So again, this seems intuitive. Spend a little bit of time on it because you do need to be able to put these in order, and occasionally people mix up things, especially between organs and organ systems. Although I think last semester, after I actually said that and specified that, people messed up around, I think, molecules and cells instead. So just give yourself a couple of extra minutes on that. More time than you think you need to study that. Okay, characteristics of living organisms. There are 7 characteristics, and this is a little bit of a weird way to phrase this. Organization is number 1. It's organization based on cells. It's cell theory. So there's this thing called cell theory, and every living thing is based on cells, one or more cells. If it's not made of cells, it is technically not a living thing. And all cells come from pre-existing cells. That's cell theory. So that is our most fundamental aspect of living things. Is it living or non-living? Does it have cells? Which is why some people argue that a virus is not a cell. We'll be talking about viruses quite a bit in this program. We'll be talking about them especially in A&P, pathophysiology. I teach A&P 1 and 2 and pathophysiology. So quite a bit in pathophysiology. You have microbiology as well after A&P 2. So you will be hearing quite a bit about viruses. What viruses are a protein capsule with a bit of genetic information inside. And that does not make up a cell. They are not cells. So even though they have a reproductive method, even though they regulate and adapt, and they even have an evolutionary history to an extent in a technical way, we do not, as scientists, consider them living things, because they are not alive, because they are not made of cells. So metabolism, all the rest of these are essentially based on cells, right? Metabolism is the building up and breaking down of molecules, especially in terms of utilizing energy in the cell. And those all metabolism requires cellular processes. Growth and development changing over time, responsiveness, especially to the environment. Does it respond to the environment? Does the environment have an effect on it? The ability to adapt, the ability to regulate, and the ability to reproduce. This especially goes into evolutionary history. So does it have an evolutionary history? Quick note on that, you don't have to believe what I believe in terms of evolution. You do have to learn what is considered technically correct by scientific consensus. So you don't have to believe in it, you just have to learn it. That's how I deal with questions of evolution. All right, 11 organ systems in the human body. Each system contains organs that work together to perform specific functions. All organs systems make up the organism. And yes, you do need to be able to say, okay, the integumentary system, that's hair, skin, and nails. It's a protective barrier. The skeletal system provides structure, support, protection. It's also a store for calcium. It's going to be related to calcium homeostasis. The muscular system, sometimes we consider this one system, the musculoskeletal system. Muscular system provides movement and warmth. Nervous system controls all of the other systems for the most part. Sensation and motor responses, integration, could go on forever about that. We won't. This, I believe, can't read it, endocrine system. Yes, that's our endocrine system. That's hormones. It's regulated by the nervous system, but it's going to regulate a lot of aspects of the functioning of the human body. Cardiovascular system, transport of nutrients, oxygenation, deoxygenation, things like that. Very important system as it turns out. The lymphatic system is going to be involved in immunity. It's going to be, let's see, filtration system, immunity, drainage, draining things, draining excess fluid from the space between cells. We'll talk about that later. Respiratory, inhalation, exhalation, oxygen and gas exchange is its major function. Gastrointestinal, intake and processing, metabolism, intake and processing of nutrients. Urinary system, also known as renal system. That's kidneys and ureters and the bladder. That's going to filter out the blood, get rid of drugs, get rid of toxins, get rid of excess solutes, sodium, potassium, chloride, things like that. And reproductive system, continuing our species with the reproductive organs. And again, reproductive organs, this is equal to every other system in the human body. We will give it as much attention as every other system, and we will need to learn to, we can giggle about it a little bit, it's okay, we're allowed, but we'll also learn to be adults and professionals about it as well. I've never really had an issue with the system with college level students. We're gonna be fine. So anatomy has a very precise language, and things have to be very carefully regulated. First thing that has to be regulated when we're using the language of anatomy is the anatomic position. It's a universal position for comparing structures. Why would there be problems with comparing positions of structures? What if I say the nose is up from the mouth? Why is that problematic? Well, it's problematic because a cadaver is lying down on a table, your patient's lying down in a bed. Maybe one day you're going to work for the coroner's office or the MEs or some other sort of crime scene investigation unit. I don't know, where you're going to find a body upside down somewhere. You can't say the nose is up from the mouth because it's not up anymore. That's why we have anatomic position and our anatomical relationship terms. They are not up, down, left, or right. You instead have things like this: anterior, posterior, superior, inferior, medial, lateral, proximal, distal, just to start out. So here's the anatomic position. You are standing upright, your feet are parallel to the floor, your head is level, you are looking forward, arms are at the side of your body, and your palms are facing forward, thumbs pointing away from the body. Why are your palms facing forward? Later on, we're going to learn about the radius and the ulna. Those are the two bones in your forearm. And you will find that when your palms face forward, they are nice and parallel. If your palms face towards the back, they actually cross over one another. And that is why we make this anatomic position. All of the bones are nice and parallel to each other. Nothing's crossing over, nothing's twisting, nothing's bending weirdly. So this is anatomic position, and yes, you need to memorize that. This is a nice thing to put into muscle memory. Anytime you can incorporate different types of memory into your studying processes, it will help you downstream. It helps to take as many senses in and learn things in several different ways. So actually physically do this and tell yourself, this is anatomic position, my palms are facing forward, so on and so forth. So sections and planes. Let's go ahead and differentiate sections and planes. This is on your worksheet. A section is a cut or slice through a structure. So this is what you might do when you are actually working with a cadaver, is sectioning a cadaver. A plane is an imaginary flat surface passing through the body or an organ. So we have imaginary planes, we have words for all of the planes. A section can be any cut or slice, but it is physically separating in reality, two different structures on the human body. So here are anatomic planes. The first is coronal. So if anybody has a Spanish-speaking background, this will sound really familiar. It means crown. So imagine a crown sort of up on the top of your head, and this is going to divide the front of your body from the back of your body. And we call that anterior and posterior, respectively. So this is a slice right down from the top of your head off to the side and down. I'm doing this physically. You can't see me because I am just a voice over a screencast right now, but there's a picture for it. Our coronal plane is this purple plane right here. The corona, the crown. So in, old-timey crowns, more like this than like that. Transverse or horizontal plane. Oh yeah, frontal plane. A note about frontal. This is also a regional term for the forehead region. So people can use this technically interchangeably. Coronal and frontal plane. They both mean this purple plane right here. The transverse or horizontal plane divides the body into superior and inferior parts. Again, our directional terms. Superior being up, air quotes up, from when you're standing up in anatomic position, and inferior being lower when you're standing up. So this is the green plane right here. And again, this is transverse at this level. You can move this up or down, right? You can have a transverse plane through the shoulders, a transverse plane through the knees, a transverse plane through the feet, and so on and so forth. Same with coronal. You can have a more anteriorly placed coronal plane. Mid-sagittal or median plane specifies this midline. So the one that's in pink here is considered to be mid-sagittal. There's also simply sagittal. It doesn't have to be mid-sagittal, but when it is mid-sagittal, we refer to it as mid-sagittal. You can clearly see that this is a mid-sagittal section. This is very much the midline, the median section. But if we moved this a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right, it would just be a sagittal section. An oblique plane passes through the specimen at random angle, any angle that is other than these perfectly straight up and down, left and right, mid-sagittal, transverse, and coronal sections. Or anything else is an oblique plane. So if we were going to take the small intestine, which bends and twists and curves, and does all kinds of crazy things, and we just took a plane through it, depending on which type of plane, that intestine is going to give us a very different impression. If we do this plane, it's going to look like an open U shape. If we do this plane, it looks like an O with a dangly bit here because it caught this part as it went down. This looks oblong, this looks like a figure 8, and so forth. And it looks perfectly round here, right? This is going to be the nature of our histology samples. It's going to be the nature of our cross-sectional anatomy images. So this is taking a three-dimensional object, cutting it into a slice, and being able to make sense of all of these shapes that you end up seeing. We're going to kind of go back and forth. I'll show you a bit of radiology here and there. I'm going to show you a lot of histology. This is a big deal in histology, getting your brain to understand two-dimensional objects as and imagining them as the complex three-dimensional objects. So directions, we've already touched on this a little bit. You know, anterior is the front of your body, the posterior is the back of your body. Superior is towards your head, inferior is towards your feet. Then there's also medial versus lateral and proximal versus distal. So medial means towards the midline. It's a little bit harder to illustrate compared to other features. We can say to the left or to the right to a degree, but it's usually better to use medial and lateral. Medial towards the midline of the body, lateral away from the midline of the body. Proximal mostly refers to extremities. Proximal means towards the body. Distal means away from the body. From the trunk is another way to think of that. Away from the trunk, distal, towards the trunk, proximal. There's one other context in which I use proximal and distal. Again, that'll be gastrointestinal tract. And when I use proximal, I mean towards the mouth. When I use distal, I mean away from the mouth, closer to the anus. It's not as commonly used that way as it is for extremities, though. Focus on extremities for now. Here are all of your terms in one convenient place. There's a couple that we haven't referred to yet. Sometimes there are other secondary terms to refer to the same things. We also have dorsal and ventral to represent the same thing as posterior and anterior. So on humans, dorsal is synonymous with posterior. Ventral is synonymous with anterior. Why do we have more than one for a term for these things? Animals. Think of animals. Think of a dog that's down on all fours. What's its anterior surface going to be? Well, if you're a dog, you have a ventral surface that's going to be towards your belly, and your dorsal surface is going to be towards your back. And it makes a lot more sense for animals to consider them that way. It's like dorsal as in dorsal fin, as in like what a dolphin has, right? So that's why we end up with more than one phrase. Same thing with cranial and caudal. These are going to be terms that are easier to apply to animals, but we see them used interchangeably with superior and inferior even in human models. So cranial towards the head, caudal towards the tail or towards the rear. So again, this works even better for four-legged creatures, but we do use this especially in neuroscience, cranial, caudal, and rostral towards the nose. So imagine a rat. We do a lot of our neuroscience research on rats. So we have to, the nose is going to be the sort of frontmost feature on a rat. So we talk about how this is part of the rostral brain, and it's going to be the part that's closest to the nose. Ipsilateral and contralateral we haven't covered yet. Ipsilateral means on the same side. Your right hand is ipsilateral to your right foot. Your right hand is contralateral to the left foot. Deep and superficial are also very important concepts, especially when we start studying muscles, for example. So something that is deep is going to be more internal. Something that is superficial is going to be more external. So your skin is superficial to your muscles, for example. Regionally, you also have axial and appendicular. Axial means the head, neck, and trunk, the vertical axis of the body. Appendicular, appendages, your upper and lower limbs. Your appendages are appendicular. You will see this division when we get to skeletal anatomy. There are a lot of regional terms to study. I am not going to read this entire thing to you, but let's see what I can do for you. So there's a lot of Latin here. What I recommend doing as you go through study this is look up word roots if you're not already familiar with them. I believe you're getting medical terminology at the same time. There's a lot of overlap. It's very beneficial that you have that overlap. For this specific chart, a lot of these terms literally mean the description of them. Cephalic literally refers to the head. The cervical literally refers to the neck. That is the word root. You're going to see other anatomical terms that utilize the word cervical to refer to an anatomical neck of some kind. For example, the cervix of the uterus is the narrow part of the uterus as it enters into the vagina. So it is very relevant to study everything on this page. See if I can find something especially useful. Inguinal, we're going to see inguinal a lot, referring to the groin area, really the part of your hip that's kind of jutting out a little bit, that bony hip region, that's inguinal. Manus referring to hand, pedis referring to foot, pes or pedis both refer to foot. You will see all of these terms again, occipital, for example, patellar, the kneecap literally is the patella. Occipital being the back of the head. Again, you have an occipital bone, so that's going to come back as well. I think that's a good overview. Spend some time with this chart for sure. Put that back. Try to fit my screen here. Oh boy. Oh, that's going to be tough. Okay, moving on. You also need to study body cavities today. You are going to have coloring pages for regional anatomy and for body cavities. You actually are going to need to fill out and label the regional anatomy. It's not already on the coloring page that I'm giving you, and that is a good, strong exercise. It's a good idea to do that. All right, body cavities, again, you have a coloring page for this as well. You have a posterior body cavity that contains your cranial cavity formed by skull bones and the vertebral canal formed by vertebral column bones, your vertebrae, your spinal column. And then you have ventral cavities, which are divided into thoracic and abdominopelvic. Thoracic referring to the thorax, which in humans is the lungs and the heart. And abdominopelvic, some people say it's an abdominal cavity and a pelvic cavity. Some people combine them into abdominopelvic. Everything with your gastrointestinal tract, your stomach, your large and small intestine, your liver, and your reproductive organs down in that pelvic cavity, as well as your bladder in the pelvic cavity. So here is the filled out version of your coloring page, you could say. The thoracic cavity is further subdivided into the pleural cavity and the pericardial cavity and the mediastinum. Your thoracic cavity and your abdominal cavity are divided by the diaphragm. It's a muscle. It's your respiratory diaphragm muscle. And as you can see, this can be considered subdivided into abdominal and pelvic cavity. There's no membrane separating the abdominal and pelvic cavity. It's an imaginary line from part of your pelvis that we use to delineate the pelvic cavity. So yes, you need to know thoracic cavity, you need to know pleural cavity, referring to lungs, pericardial cavity, mediastinum, all of that. And your cranial and vertebral canal making up your posterior, some people call this simply the posterior cavity as opposed to the ventral cavity. Again, ventral cavity including thoracic and abdominopelvic. Any questions about those subdivisions, please let me know. Send me an email. This just summarizes the previous slide. So membranes, all of those cavities, all of those chambers are lined by serous membranes. Serous membranes are defined as something, as a layer that produces serous fluid. It protects against friction between moving organs. So before you are born until the moment you die, your heart is beating in this pericardial cavity right here. That is a lot of friction. So we're going to put a couple of membranes around it and we're going to fill it with fluid so that that friction isn't just rubbing on those cells all of your life. If we did have a lot of rub on those cells, that heart muscle is not going to last long. Heart muscle does not heal well, and we'll talk about why that is later this semester, or next semester rather. So this double layered membrane is going to have a visceral layer and a parietal layer. So viscera, what do you think of when you think of the word viscera? For me, I think of intestines, I think of guts, and that's pretty accurate for this. It's going to directly cover the organ itself. Parietal has a word root that means wall. and it's going to line the internal surface of the body wall. You're going to see the word parietal in a few different contexts, so internalize the phrase wall. Parietal equals wall. So on your heart, the visceral layer covers the heart itself. The parietal layer is going to line the wall of the pericardial cavity, if that makes sense. For the most part, that parietal layer is going to be out at the actual body wall. For portions of the heart, that wall is in between the heart and the lungs. It's more of a symbolic wall, but it's still a wall. And again, serous membrane secreting serous fluid to reduce friction, protect organs. So that's a kind of a better visualization right there of this double layer. When you actually take out the heart, it's not as clear. It's not a nice, green illustrated large gap. It's pretty adhered to other features. In a living creature, in a living organism, you'll see greater evidence of this space in between our layers, but they are continuous with each other. You'll see very much like a hand being punched into a balloon, which is why you see this in pretty much every textbook ever. There's always a hand punching into a balloon. The visceral layer adhered to the organ. Parietal layer continuous with the visceral layer. The serous fluid is inside this environment here. Inside of your abdominopelvic cavity, this is called peritoneum. Peritoneum. The correct pronunciation in anatomy is however your instructor heard it the first time they read it to themselves. As far as I'm concerned, there's no true, real best pronunciation. You're going to come across medical professionals who have some weird way of pronouncing peritoneum or peritoneum. People have their own weird pronunciations for things. So get used to the idea that not everybody's going to pronounce it the way you do. Let your brain be flexible about the words you hear and how they're going to be pronounced. So visceral and parietal peritoneum, that's going to be the serous membrane attaching to the body wall for the parietal layer and to the gastrointestinal tract, to the GI organs viscerally. Visceral peritoneum adhered to small and large intestine, liver, stomach, etc. Parietal peritoneum adhered to the body wall, and lots of fluid in between these spaces. Same thing with pleural cavity. Pleura, pulmonary system, again, Spanish pulmo, referring to lungs. Pleura, pleural cavity, lungs as well. Parietal pleura along the body wall, and visceral pleura adhered to the lungs. Continuous membrane filled with serous fluid, decreasing the friction the lungs experience as they expand and contract on a moment-by-moment basis. The heart is located in a middle compartment called the mediastinum. So let's go back here real quick. Pericardial cavity plus mediastinum. The whole middle portion can also be considered mediastinum. There's this special sort of superior region. There is a little bit of membranous separation right here. The whole middle compartment is the mediastinum. You could also say everything in the thoracic cavity except for the pleural cavity is the mediastinum. That's another way to say that. So the heart and the features superior to the heart, the aorta, the superior vena cava, some glandular things, are all located within the mediastinum. So we've pretty much covered this. I've freshly edited all of these PowerPoints this semester. That's why I'll be uploading them in a staggered fashion as I continue to improve them. What I've done is I've put the images first so that we can get a big picture view of them, and then I've put our sort of wordy explanations after the fact so that we can track down any nitty-gritty that I may have missed while I was talking about it with the picture. I think we've caught all of this. But again, remember, on exams, it's to the level that you experience in the PowerPoint. If there's some nitty-gritty information that you find in this slide, you're going to want to write it down because there's a good chance it'll be on the exam. There's a possibility it'll be on the exam. Okay, I think we've covered all of this as well. Covered that as well. Good there. Okay, and again, abdominal cavity is superior to the pelvic cavity. The pelvic cavity is inferior to the abdominal cavity. You can combine them theoretically to become the abdominopelvic cavity. There's only an imaginary horizontal line drawn across the superior border of both hip bones. By the end of the semester, you're going to call them something much more specific than hip bones. So again, peritoneum being our serous membrane of the abdominopelvic cavities. So regions and quadrants. This is again something you're going to want to illustrate, and it's on your worksheets for that region. This is something that we use clinically. It's imaginary lines that we use to allow ourselves to create divisions, sort of imaginary divisions. We can also use it clinically to say, okay, where does it hurt? We might end up taking notes on this one day. Patient reports pain in the umbilical region, for example. You are going to want a solid grasp of what all of these terms are: right hypochondriac region, epigastric region, left hypochondriac region, left lumbar, right iliac, left iliac, and hypogastric. You want the terms and you want a basic overview of what's in them. So, for example, epigastric region, we see liver and we see stomach. Umbilical region, we see large intestine and small intestine. Hypogastric region, we see small intestine. I see a bladder right there. Your spleen is over here. A big portion of your liver is over here. That's pretty good summary. Reproductive organs here in hypogastric. Iliac refers to this crest of the hip bone, but we also use it as a regional term. Lumbar refers to the bottom portion of your spinal column, the inferior portion of your spinal column. So this works for lumbar. Umbilical refers to your umbilicus, your belly button. Epi means above. Gastric refers to belly. But oddly enough, we are simply on the stomach, right? So it's a little bit of a misnomer, but we still have to memorize it this way. So yes, on your worksheets, illustrate them and maybe do some annotations. What organ is there? Answer: spleen. There's also quadrants, and again, you might end up doing notations using this terminology later on in your careers. Right upper quadrant, right lower quadrant, left upper quadrant, left lower quadrant. This is a simplified version. I'm a big fan of it. So if a patient reports right lower quadrant pain, what might you suspect? Well, what about the appendix? It's right there. That's there in your right lower quadrant. So you're also going to be illustrating that. That is actually our last slide of Chapter 1. So I'm going to go ahead and close this, upload it, and start getting to work on lecture number 2. In the meantime, I recommend coloring pages for this, annotating on the worksheet for regions. One thing that I like to do with your regional anatomy terms is a game of Simon Says. That's something maybe you can practice with your family. Have some family member say, Simon says axillary, and you have to point to your armpit. Simon says pollex, and you have to point to your thumb, and so on and so forth. That is a really good way to practice. It feels like kindergarten, but it's very practical. I love doing things like that when I can. That's what I recommend. Good luck, and I will talk to you soon.